So, welcome to Grumpy Vegan Grandad. This is a quick video as it's a response from Joey Carbstrong. If you don't know the story, descriptions in the link below is a video posted from Paul Bashir on behalf of AV, Anonymous for the Voiceless, who put out a video, quite a damning video, for some reason trying to damage Joey's reputation. And they told a story that wasn't quite the full truth. Probably many of you have seen the response from Joey that went up tonight, but I thought I'd take this opportunity to just read through the statement. Because firstly, I watched the video and I watched it with an open mind. Wondered, like the rest of you guys, what the hell is going on here? And when I watched it, the full hour or so of it, I thought there's something not quite right here with what they were saying. And I did speak with Joey later that day, but obviously he didn't want me to say anything. And I didn't want to get involved in any way with a response to it. It's totally down to Joey how he handles it, and it's done a lot of damage to his reputation, because a lot of people are very quick to assume because somebody says something it must be the truth. And because one side of the story has been told, that is the total truth. And personally, whether Joey's a friend or not, I do not never take one side of the story until I've heard the other side. And what bothers me is that AV are supposed to be for the animals, a very successful group that do cubes of truth, worldwide reach. And why post the video? Why did they not go through all this behind closed doors? Why did they put this video out there? The only reason I can see was to damage Joey. And why do that? But it's backfired slightly because a hell of a lot of people have seen right through what they were saying. You can see it. They protest too much. An hour making up excuse after excuse after excuse. So I'm just going to read through the statement and that'll be video over. But stick along and have a read through with me. The following statement is a response to the recent situation with Anonymous for the Voiceless, AV. Firstly, I want to address the claim made by Paul and Asal from the AV that I set out to cancel AV. This accusation is damaging and untrue. I've collaborated with and promoted AV across my channels from day one, which he has. I've had an AV link in my YouTube channel for years, and I had a segment on AV outreach in nearly all my speeches, encouraging activists to join. What happened was a major donor had concerns with AV, and the relationship between this donor and Paul and Asal was breaking down. This came to a head after AV published a controversial Black Lives Matter protest post, which upset many people and resulted in a number of complaints to AV's donor. This was compounded by other concerns, including AV groups not receiving funding from Paul and Asal. After much consideration, the donor reached out to me to help to try and resolve the matter. As a friend of the donor, I was asked to be involved because I had no ill feelings towards AV and in fact had been a long-time friend and supporter of the work. Furthermore, I have experience and understanding with grassroots activism on the ground. The goal was to help AV continue to receive their funding and work with them in fulfilling the donor's request for financial transparency. Although I was a little taken aback by this request to get involved, I assumed that as a non-profit organisation they would be open, honest and compliant to regain the trust of their donor. Of course. The impression given by AV was that their funding started this year. although they did receive a large amount of funding in 2019 as well. The budget agreed by the donor was for $1.5 million US. That was to be paid in blocks of $100,000 US roughly every 3 weeks. AV had already received around half of their funding for the year, around $700,000 US, almost $1 million Australian dollars. The main financial concerns included the breakdown in salary costs, $946,000, the AV fund, $360,000, which is a number of AV groups said they hadn't received. The high cost of developing an app, $150,000 Australian dollars, and a large touring campaign budget of $300K in a year when travel was restricted because of COVID. They also never readjusted this travel budget to suit the current situation of all travel being restricted. Operationally, there were more concerns with Asal being the only treasurer and the handling of all the funds and payroll. For the founder to have sole responsibility for these functions in an organisation of this size and income, it did raise concern and is not best practice for demonstrating strong financial controls. In most charities, there is an independent board of trustees who oversee the organisation's operations and financial stability. This is not the case with AV, where there is a lack of financial accountability, and all funds are received and distributed by Paul and Asal as they see fit, with no oversight by anyone else in the organisation. After back and forth deliberation with AV and the donor, Paul and Asal refused to give the type of transparency the donor is requesting. We had support of a professional accountant, so I wouldn't have been operating on my own, as has been suggested. The fact that Paul and Asal claimed they wouldn't give the donor access to their charity accounts because they had their personal accounts linked in with them, which is strange, and after consulting with a professional is extremely out of the ordinary. I mean, why would you have your personal accounts linked in with a charity account? In our first call, Paul said to me they had been putting away money for a rainy day, and that's why the budget numbers might have been higher than their actual spend. After I said to Paul this might not look good if you have reserve money that you haven't declared to the donor, Paul later retracted this statement, claiming they had no reserve of money, which did leave me confused and suspicious. The claim made by Paul and Asal that if we were given access to the charity account we would take the money back really surprised me, seeing as Paul claimed they had actually no reserve funds. And it's also ridiculous to believe that I would steal from them when I have access to the same donor they do. They also claimed to me in one of our calls that although they might have needed the donor at the beginning, they don't necessarily need them anymore and they could go on without them. This didn't make sense as they had so many staff. They say they have 30 and no reserve of funds, yet they would rather let go of their main source of funding instead of giving the donor transparency they were looking for. This did ring alarm bells with me, as it seemed they would rather lose $1.5 million US a year than comply with the donor's request, essentially defunding the whole of AV. This money the donor gives is for the animals, and if they are not 100% confident on where the funding is going, then they have every right to stop funding, as does anyone. The donor has never defunded an organisation like this before, so these circumstances were unique. AV were reluctant to take suggestions from the donor, showed arrogance and spoke with contempt towards almost all involved. Also, for them to compare my Patreon, my YouTube and the rather modest amounts I receive from the donor to help with a few staff, 2 full-time staff and some occasional freelancers, and travel when needed, to organisation with a $2.2 million Australian dollar a year income is nowhere near comparable and extremely misleading on their part. As a public charity with one major donor, it should not come as a surprise to be expected to provide this kind of transparency. If you refuse and your funding is cut by the donor, I'm sorry, but that is not my fault. Paul and Asal have made some incredibly damaging claims about my intentions when I was just trying to help them, when no one else would. I tried my best to help AV come to an amicable solution with the donor so AV could continue receiving their funding, but the donor was very firm on their request for this type of financial transparency. As the numbers were so high, but the donor was very firm on their request for this type of financial transparency as the numbers were so high. AV claimed on many occasions on our calls that they already knew their funding may be cut for other reasons than that they were prepared for that, so to blame me for defunding AV is dishonest and disappointing. No matter what my relationship is with the founders of AV, I will always support grassroots activists on the ground. Thank you for taking the time to consider my side of these events. This will be my final statement on the matter, as I need to focus my efforts on the animals. So, there's the flip side of the argument. There's the flip side of it all. And he does answer a few questions. I mean, the amounts are staggering. 1.5 million. Now, don't get me wrong. If somebody was giving me £500 a week and wanted to know what I was spending it on, I would bend over backwards to show them. It does not make sense. And it looked fishy from the very beginning. The hour-long video by Paul Bashir and Asal. Wow. It just excuse after excuse after excuse after excuse. Why were they expecting to be defunded? You know? So I think the moral of the story is, listen to both sides of the story before you make a decision. Thank you and good luck to Joey.